Do your aquarium lights need to be on all day? No, they don't. And here's why. Having your fish tank lights on all the time is a lot like having it in direct sunlight all the time. And that's just a recipe for disaster. Well, not disaster, so to speak, but if you want to have an algae-free aquarium or minimal algae, then you shouldn't have your lights on all the time. You're never going to get rid of algae completely. You can fill up a bottle from your tap or your faucet and put it on a windowsill where it's going to get some direct sunlight, and eventually you're going to find that it grows algae, especially if it's uncovered. And that's because algae is just, the spores are just in the air. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. There's no getting away from it. We can take steps to reduce algae, but you know, if you're fighting algae completely, it's a losing battle. It's a natural part of your system, and it's not that bad. This tank has algae in it. Sure, it looks a little bit green, but actually that's from the floaters up top, which I can show you in just a moment. There you go. There's a quick picture on all the duckweed sitting at the top of my tank. The sides of my aquarium are covered in algae. The front is clear because the front is the viewing angle, and in general algae is not a bad thing. It will help to feed your fish, especially algae eaters, and some fish like guppies like to have a little nibble at it. It's just a bit of greenery for them. It's really healthy for them. And algae will act as another plant in your tank. It's not technically a plant, but it acts as such. It photosynthesizes, it removes waste products from the water, like what we talked about in the previous video talking about the nitrogen cycle, which I'll try and link to. I'm still learning, so bear with me, but I'll try and link to it. So algae's not the devil in your aquarium. You can work with it, you can find a balance, just like nature. You know, you're trying to find a balance within your aquarium, within the system. And if you keep fighting and fighting and fighting nature, somebody's going to lose. And it's either going to be you who loses or your fish that lose. There's no sense in fighting it. But what you can do is create a balance. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So you don't need your lights on. I've got my lights on because of the video. Normally my lights are off during this period of the day. You don't need your lights on all the time, just like I said at the start of the video. My tank has a siesta period of, it was 6 hours, now I think it's down to 4 hours, because I find that I didn't need so long a siesta period with this tank. My shrimp bowl, on the other hand, that only has 6 hours of light per day, and it's flourishing. I'll do a video on it sometime soon. In fact, I need to trim it back. It's quite something. But if you have your lights on all the time, all day, then that's like having full sunshine on a small body of water, and of course it's gonna grow algae, because that's just what nature does, and this is a slice of nature in your home. So what you want to do, you want to introduce a cloudy period of the day where your curtains are open, your curtains are drawn, and you've got ambient light coming in. So instead of direct sunlight, you know, it's this sort of thing where maybe, like with plants, indirect sunlight is I can see the sun, but the sun can't see me. The same kind of thing going on with your tank, really. It's absolutely fine to have an ambient lighting period. In fact, it's really good for the fish too, because it means that they're not constantly in hiding mode. Because when you think about it, if you're a prey animal for the likes of birds and things, if you're in direct sunlight all the time, Oh boy, that's like having a spotlight on you. That must be terrifying. So floating plants can help with that. But ultimately, a period of the day where it's dimmer and calmer, maybe you're not home, maybe you're away at work for a little bit, maybe you're away at school, or maybe it's a time of day where you're just not in the room, or you don't mind the lights being off. That's a good time of day to do it. So the time of day that I normally have my lights off is between 9 and 2, so about 5 hours of a siesta period, with the lights gradually coming on and with the lights gradually coming off and then on again. I can't do English today. I'm very sleep deprived. Another thing that you'll want to look at is the nutrient content of your water. And by nutrient content, I mean things like waste products, like your ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, your nitrogen compounds. But also you might want to think about your phosphorus compounds. They're known to cause algae. The tricky thing is, again, you need a balance. A quick one while I'm editing. Don't overfeed your fish either. Make sure you're feeding them something high quality. Like, this is part of their diet. I feed my fish probably a couple of times a week, quite heavily. They're fine. You do not need to feed your fish every single day. My fish are thriving. Look at them down here. They're absolutely thriving. They do not need to be fed multiple times a day. They don't need it. Don't do it. Don't fall into the trap. They're lying to you. They're always hungry. And if you feed them all the time, or if you feed them multiple times a day, you're just going to add too many nutrients into the water column, and you're going to end up with loads and loads of algae. So don't do it. You're going to be okay. Your fish are going to be fine. Your plants within your aquarium will rely upon those nutrients, so you can't just take them away completely. So what I do is the water column, I don't fertilise it. I used to, and then I had an algae problem. So I just do fewer water changes now. And I know it's very controversial advice. You know, make sure you check your water parameters regularly, especially if you're new to not changing your water so frequently. I know my fish, I know my livestock in the tank. I've got kind of the equivalent of canaries in the coal mine in the tank by means of shrimp, and I know their behaviours. So if something's off, I can look at the animals in my tank and see that they're not behaving quite as they normally do. Maybe the shrimp are going absolutely nuts swimming about, and if the shrimp are swimming about, then if it's all males, it's just part of the mating scene. If the females are doing it too, however, there's something going on there, because females don't do the crazy dance. So if you know the animals within your system and you know their usual behaviours, then you can pick up on when something's off balance, and then you know to check something or to change something. So I do fewer water changes, and I let the plants do most of the filtering, or the filtering of waste compounds within the tank. I have you can see here, I have a really thick substrate layer, which is comprised of sand mainly. I do have some gravel in the substrate layer, which you can see up at the top, mainly for accenting. There is some gravel interspersed amongst the sand, and the reason why I've used sand is because if you think back to being at the beach and you're near the ocean and you start stomping on the sand bit by bit, your foot starts to sink, right? And eventually you start trying to pull up, and the sand it grabs your foot and it tries to pull you in deeper. The same sort of thing happens with fish waste, where with a deep layer, over time, the fish waste will slowly start to sink into the sand. And as long as you don't disturb it, then it'll stay in there, provided that it is sand and that it's a deep enough substrate. Like this one. This is about roughly 2 inches worth of sand on top of some aquarium soil. Now, the big advantage of being able to trap all of those waste products within your sand is that it means that they are not interspersed in the water column. And if those nutrients aren't in the water column, then it means that there's no free food for the algae to feast upon. And on top of that, then all your stem plants, all of your plants even, that have their roots tapped into that sand, a little buffet for them. And then those plants can outcompete the algae for carbon dioxide or CO2 within the tank. You can get algae eaters like Autosynclus or hellstream loaches, Siamese algae eaters, even particularly young Plecostomus. I think you call them plecos over in the States. We call them plex normally, just pleco minus the O, just plec. But for just so that everyone's on the same page, I'm just going to call them Plecostomus. They are really good at eating algae when they're little, but then as they get older, it'll vary by species, but as they get older, as a rule of thumb, they'll become a bit more lazy in terms of algae eating, and people go on about it, and they're not wrong. They are poo machines. They really are. They will dirty up your water about the same as goldfish will. They just eat and poo, and there's no real, there's no in between. They're just poo machines. They do not clean your tank. They'll help to get rid of the algae to an extent, but there are so many better alternatives for that. I think that if you want to get a Plecostomus, you should have a Plecostomus for the sake of having a fish that you love, rather than trying to get something that's going to eat the poo or just clean the tank for you. And besides, we talked about this. You don't want a clean tank. You want a tank that finds balance, just like nature does. So there's Autosynclus, there's hellstream loaches, to an extent there's Plecostomus, there's Siamese algae eaters. Again, I think they get lazier as they get older, but I've never had one, so that's not from experience, that's just from what I've heard along the grapevine. And then there's your snails, like your nerites are really good for eating algae. However, nerites are they're going to be 50-50 on whether or not you end up with little sesame seeds littered across your aquarium. I have them in my shrimp bowl. Unfortunately, my nerite snail, it perished. It did end up dying, but it left a legacy of little sesame seed like eggs. They will not hatch because they require brackish water in order to hatch. However, that does mean that there's just kind of white little sesame seed looking things all over your fish tank, which is fine if you don't mind it. I would rather it wasn't on my big display tank, so I'm not having nerite snails. I have a lot of bladder snails. Bladder snails are fantastic little algae eaters. Their only problem is that their population can get out of control pretty quickly, but if you don't mind them, then they're ace. I've still got some bladder snails in here. They were largely dealt with by the Corydoras and the assassin snails in the tank. just because their population was getting a little bit unruly. So I plopped in 4 assassin snails and just let them have at it. And you might be able to see here, there's a little bit of a snail graveyard next to that little panda corridora. Hello. He's hiding behind me right now. Yeah, from experience, bladder snails are really good. They're also really good for getting into all the tiny little crevices that you didn't even know you had in your tank. Sometimes food will fall into these crevices, just tiny little pockets. You know, maybe underneath this bit of wood here, maybe there's some hidden compartments, if you like, that the fish can't quite get into. You can bet the snails can, which is fabulous because it means that the food doesn't rot and have, you know, it doesn't create ammonia and all that stuff. So we've talked about lighting, we've talked about nutrients within your water column, and how having a deep substrate layer, especially sand, is really good for keeping the nutrients out of the water column and locked in to your substrate for your plants to use instead of the algae. We've talked about aquarium helpers like your Otocinclus and other fish that really love to graze on algae. Another thing that you can do, which I touched on briefly, talking about the free floating nutrients in the water column, is your plants. You'll find in bare tanks or tanks with minimal plants in that they are overcome by algae a lot more easily and a lot more quickly than a planted tank. And a tank that has a lot of plants everywhere is much less prone to algae problems, because what happens is the plants are a lot more efficient at absorbing nutrients than algae is. Alga? Anyway, they're a lot more efficient at absorbing nutrients out of the water column, which is fabulous for us because it means that we've got a ready-made fix. If you enjoy a natural aquarium, then you're already on the right track to solving a lot of your algae problems. So your fast-growing plants like your Ludwigia, Limnophila, Rotala, your stem plants in general, hornwort is really good for it. Although hornwort grows quickly and it can die quickly, you need to keep an eye out for it. But generally speaking, I do like it. A lot of people don't, so don't come at me. I mean, you can come at me if you want, and we can have a good sportsmanship debate about it. I do like hornwort. It's very good at sucking up waste products. I don't know if I would consider it a true stem plant. Maybe it is, but it doesn't really like being planted in the soil or in the sand at the substrate of your aquarium. It just prefers to float around a bit like Elodea or Elodia, some people pronounce it as. That's just happy to float about. In fact, you can even find it in Loch Lomond. Your floating plants, like your duckweed, a lot of people hate duckweed. I have a love-hate relationship with it because it is so good at absorbing nutrients out of the water. It grows so quickly that's why it's so good at absorbing nutrients out of the water. It creates a lovely canopy for the fish so that they don't always feel like they've got a spotlight on them. But having said that, it's known as aquarium glitter or even aquarium herpes for a reason. Once you've got it, you're going to be hard pressed to get it out of your tank. And it's not impossible to get it out of your tank, don't get me wrong. But it's also kind of annoying when you have to put your hand in for whatever reason. Maybe you're cleaning your pre-filter sponge. and you take out your hand and you're just a swamp monster. And it's something that you should try to not get in your waterways if you can help it, because even if it's endemic to your area, like duckweed is native to the UK, so I'm not worried about it. This species of duckweed, Lemna minor, this is native to the UK, but you still want to try to not introduce it to your waterways, even if it is endemic to your country, because it might be endemic, but the bacteria and little microorganisms that might be on it might not be, because I mean, we get plants and fish from all over the world, so you know, it's maybe not the best thing to introduce to waterways, especially if your water company, Thames Water, is not treating water properly and is dumping raw sewage into rivers. It's disgusting. Please stop. Please get a grip on it, because we pay you. And what do we pay you for? To dump raw sewage in the rivers? Disgusting.
Disgusting!
So duckweed is an option for your floating plants. You've got other options like red root floaters or salvinia, water lettuce, frogbit. You've got a whole host of potential floating plants, and they are really fantastic for dimming the lights in your tank without having an actual dimmer on your lights. If you have floating plants, you're gonna be good. The only caveat is that if they grow really quickly, they can smother the surface of the tank and then limit air exchange. So you can mitigate that with use of a bubbler like this one, or you can just scoop it out from time to time. I use a comb. I have a short video on it, and I showed that it's really effective to just scoop it up with a comb, just with bristles just wide enough to let the water through, but not so wide that the duckweed will fall through. And then you just scrape it off into your container of choice. That way your hands don't get absolutely covered in duckweed or floating plants in general, and much better. Let's put it this way. There's no downside to having plants in your tank. If you don't have a substrate layer that's adequate for planting plants, then you don't have to plant plants. You can have your floating plants. You can have plants that just like to hang out in the water column, like your hornwort or your elodea. I'm sure there's a few others. In fact, most stem plants are pretty forgiving about just being floated in the water. The next thing that you can do to mitigate algae problems in your tank, and it might not be what you want to hear, it's okay if it's not what you want to hear, it's just something that you can do, is to not just not overstock your tank, as in have too many fish in, but also you can understock your tank so that you'll never get a build-up of too much waste, so that the plants will always be able to handle the waste that's in the water, so that you will always be able to handle the waste that's in the water. If you want to handle it with water changes, then that's absolutely fine. If you would rather have a well-stocked tank, you know, with some cichlids and all the rest of it, then be my guest, it's absolutely fine. I'm not a fan of overstocking, because I don't think it's fair to the fish, and also it makes maintenance a lot harder. There are some instances, like with certain types of cichlids, where it helps to reduce aggression because they come from areas where they're just naturally overstocked, which, you know, that's a whole other kettle of fish, if you like. But for your average aquarium, don't overstock it. So that's a summary for you. You don't need your lights on all the time. Most importantly, you don't need your lights on all the time. That is the biggest mistake that beginners make when it comes to having an aquarium. is they want the lights on all the time because the tank looks pretty. Don't do it. Don't do it. Have the lights on at a meaningful time, maybe in the evening time when you're home from school or home from work and you just want to decompress and chill out on the sofa or in your bedroom and you just want to have a slice of nature in there. That's the time to have your lights on, because the rest of the time they're pretty happy in just ambient light. And with that, I will see you next time. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and a comment, because you know it's good to know when things are being well received. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, consider subscribing to the channel. It does help. And I think I'm gonna regret saying this, but we're almost at 400. We're almost at 430 subscribers, and if we get to 1,000, I'll eat it. If we get to 1,000 subscribers, I'll eat a duckweed sandwich on video for you. Just bread and duckweed. How does that sound? I'm gonna really regret that someday, aren't I? Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!